This is chapter 10 from a book called The Curse of Canaan by Eustace Mullins. For 35 years, the present writer wrote on and spoke about quote-unquote communism without knowing what it was. After consulting hundreds of reference works on communism, I had found not one mention of the fact that communism was but one branch of the world revolutionary forces of the Masonic order of Canaanites. We have previously pointed out that the members of the First Communist International were Lionel de Rothschild, Karl Marx, and Henry Heine. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing some of these names. Not only did Karl Marx maintain close ties with the Jesuits and Freemasonry throughout his career, he was also directly related to the British aristocracy through his marriage to Jenny von Westphalen, a descendant of the Countess of Balcarres and Argyll, two of the oldest titles in England. The Countess had been governess to William of Orange before he invaded England and chartered the Bank of England. It was the Masonic connection which obtained a steady income for Karl Marx through commissions for writing for New York newspapers. Lenin also maintained close Masonic ties during his years in Switzerland, before he returned to Russia to lead the Bolshevik Revolution. In Switzerland, he had become the member of a secret lodge under the name of Ulyanov Zederbaum, quote-unquote. He received regular financial support as well as occasional visits from Sir Alfred Milner, founder of the Round Tables and the Council on Foreign Relations, and Lord Palmerston, Foreign Minister of England. Both Milner and Palmerston had attained the 33rd or revolutionary degree of Freemasonry. Page 264. Meanwhile, the richest man in the world, the Tsar of Russia, seemed helpless in the face of his country's slow slide into anarchy. Long before the advent of Rasputin, his court had been rife with occultists. The Tribune de Geneva headlined a dispatch on December 21st, 1902, quote, "Russia, an occultist at court." The Daily Mail correspondent at Odessa telegraphed that paper the real facts concerning the occultist Philippe's presence at the Tsar's court. Philippe has gained great influence over the Tsar, quote unquote. The dispatch further stated that Philippe Nizier of Lyon had been presented to Nicholas by Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich. Earlier in Lyon, Nizier had been sued for an unlawful practice of medicine. A French doctor, Gerard Ancousseau, had written voluminously on Kabbalah and magic. He had been introduced by Philippe to the Grand Duke. Encausse, E-N-C-A-U-S-S-E, wrote his treatise on magic under the name Papus, P-A-P-U-S, quote-unquote. The Swiss Gazette noted, December 20th, 1902, "Few people know that there exists in Paris a kind of small university of occultism, where students register, examinations are passed, and academic degrees conferred. For instance, one can obtain a diploma of Bachelor of Occult Science or a doctor in Kabbalah. Papus is president and organizer." Thus, the occult influence at the court of Tsar Nicholas is traced directly to a school of the occult in Paris. It is not too fanciful to conjecture that this school operates with the backing of the Grand Orient of Paris, since Freemasonry is always concerned with the occult. The Tsar's later inability to act decisively in times of crisis, which led directly to the downfall of his government, may have been due to drugs or hypnotism. The world's most powerful autocrat was described by observers as, quote, "remarkably passive," and unable to take direct action when his regime was threatened with revolution. Indeed, King Louis had reacted in much the same way at the onset of the French Revolution during the weeks before he was deposed and sent to the guillotine. It is difficult to believe that such absolute autocrats would meekly resign themselves to, quote, the will of the people and go unresisting to their deaths. Apparently, at the mercy of the occult influences at his court, Tsar Nicholas was arrested and a provisional government was set up. This government was headed by Kerensky, a 32nd degree Mason who had been chosen as head of the provisional government by Joseph Sliosberg, the Grand Master of the International Order of B'nai B'rith in Russia. Kerensky had only one mission: to hold the fort until Lenin arrived on the sealed train from Switzerland. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Kerensky was permitted to peacefully emigrate to the United States, where he became a well-paid lecturer at leading universities. The Masonic Order of Canaanites always takes care of its own. Princess Paley, wife of the Grand Duke Paul, stated that the English ambassador at St. Petersburg, Sir George Buchanan, fomented and directed the Russian Revolution on direct instructions from Lloyd George, head of the Liberal Party in England. The Bolsheviks were provided with ample funds for their takeover of Russia. On September 21, 1917, Trotsky received a telegram from Stockholm. Quote, the management of the Bank of Max Warburg and Company informed him that a current account had been opened for him at Stockholm for the purposes of his quote-unquote undertaking, unquote. Trotsky had previously been presented with $10,000 in cash by the Rockefellers when he sailed from New York. Other funds were forwarded to him from Berlin through the Diskonto Gesellschaft, the Naya Bank, and the Siberian Bank, among other intermediaries such as Helfand, Parvus, Ganetsky, Kozlowski, and Krayson. After the revolution, Krayson went back to work for Siemens, the giant German electric company, as Russian representative. He was supported by Hugo Steins, Felix Deutsch, manager of AEG, and by Walter Rathenau. Page 266. Although all of the Tsar's enormous deposits in foreign banks was retained by those banks without payment to any members of his family, a small portion of his Russian holdings were set aside by the new Bolshevik government as a secret fund which was exercised final control in the Soviet government during the ensuing decades. This trust was composed of Dzerhinsky, founder of the Cheka, CHEKA, the British secret agent Sidney Riley, and W. Averill Harriman. The trust was a continuation of the Parvus Fund, which had brought Lenin to power, an operation which had been directed by the influential behind-the-scenes figure, the Venetian Count Volpi di Misurati, a black nobility figure who had put Mussolini in power, orchestrated the numerous Balkan wars, and secretly directed the Russian Revolution. Oddly enough, the Bolshevik Revolution was greeted with enthusiastic approval of many of the world's leading financiers. One of the most prominent of their number, Jacob Schiff, senior partner at Kuhn Loeb Company, New York, telegraphed his greetings as recounted in the New York Times, March 19, 1917. A persistent foe, quote, a persistent foe of the tyrannical autocracy, the merciless persecutors of my co-religionists, may I congratulate through you the Russian people upon what you have now so wonderfully achieved, and wish you and your colleagues in the new government every success. The minister, Milokov, a longtime friend of Schiff, replied, quote, "We are united in hatred and antipathy to ancient regimes now overthrown." Here again is a direct quote from The Will of Canaan, quote, "Hate your masters," unquote. One of the most misunderstood events in history is the Allied, quote-unquote, invasion of Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. This invasion, quote-unquote, again was featured recently in the Soviet press as urgent. This book was written, by the way, in the 1980s, I think. Yeah, in the 80s. As reason not to trust, quote-unquote, the United States. In fact, the Allied troops were sent to Russia to divert the successful counter-revolution of the White forces, and at the same time to give the Red Army propagandists, principally Trotsky, a rallying cry to the faltering Red campaign, that, quote, Mother Russia was being invaded by foreign troops, quote-unquote, foreign troops. This proved to be an irresistible call to the Russian peasants, who immediately rallied behind the Red Army and gave them total victory. In fact, several divisions, mostly British and American, were sent to Siberia, where they remained for a year and a half without participating in any action. None of the troops had any idea of what they were doing there. They returned home as mystified as when they had departed. Had they been assigned to, quote-unquote, invade Russia, of course, they would have landed on the European coast and marched straight toward Moscow, which could have been easily taken by these well-armed and trained divisions. They had actually been sent to Siberia to betray the White Russians. The maneuver was exposed in the New York Times, February 15, 1920, quote, when Vladivostok was liberated from the Kolchak faction. Quote, there was a pronounced pro-American feeling evident. Revolutionary leaders mounted the steps of buildings across the street, making speeches calling the Americans real friends who, at a critical time, saved the present movement, unquote. The quote-unquote mystery of the American military presence in Russia was never a mystery to its secret Masonic Canaanite backers. The three directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who were financing the Bolshevik revolution, the Bolshevik effort, realized that under Trotsky, the Red Army was losing the war. Its orgy of senseless terrorism and slaughter had turned the peasantry against the quote-unquote liberators, and the White Army was gaining daily in support. To reverse the situation, the Federal Reserve Bank directors ordered the Allied troops into Russia. Quartered near the Kolchak forces, they gave the impression that they were there to support the White faction. The Russian people were given to understand that the Allied forces were sent to restore the old autocracy. The press in America and Britain now united the Russian peasantry behind the revolutionaries, and Kolchak's army was soon in full retreat. This was the explanation of the quote-unquote pro-American feeling in Vladivostok. The Allied presence in Siberia ensured the triumph of the Red Army and the imposition of a brutal dictatorship on the people of Russia. There is ample this is page 268. There is ample documentation for the subsequent acts of terrorism which horrified the Russian people and permanently turned them against the Bolsheviks. The American Rohrbach Commission reported on some of the revolutionary atrocities. Quote, the whole cement floor of the execution hall of the Cheka of Kiev was flooded with blood. It formed a level of several inches. It was a horrible mixture of blood, brains, and pieces of skull. All the walls All the walls were smothered with blood. Pieces of brains and of scalps were sticking to them. A gutter of 25 centimeters wide by 25 centimeters deep and about 10 meters long was along its length, full to the top with blood. Some bodies were disemboweled, others had limbs chopped off, some were literally hacked to pieces. Some had their eyes put out of their heads. The face and neck and trunk were covered with deep wounds. Further on, we found a corpse with a wedge driven into its chest. Some had no tongues. In a corner, we discovered a quantity of dismembered arms and legs belonging to no bodies that we could locate. Once the White Russian threat of retribution had gone, the Bolsheviks unleashed the full fury of their Canaanite bloodlust. They converted the entire nation of Russia into a gigantic concentration camp in order to slowly torture and kill the remaining descendants of the people of Shem, who had ruled them for 1,000 years. Solzhenitsyn, later, his name is spelled, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, he's a very important person here, Solzhenitsyn, later informed an incredulous world that the Soviets had murdered 66 million people in Russia from 1918 to 1957. He cited Cheka Order Number 10, issued on January 8, 1921, quote, to intensify the repression of the bourgeoisie. This, of course, meant the people of Shem. Under this order, the concentration camps were established on a permanent basis. Typical of the bosses of these camps was Lazar Kogan, who calmly watched thousands of slave laborers die during his stint as overseer of the construction of the White Sea Canal. He greeted a new inmate with this incredible statement, quote, I believe that you personally are not guilty of anything, but as an educated person, you have to understand that social prophylaxis was being widely applied. Quote unquote, social prophylaxis was a typical Canaanite euphemism for the massacre of the people of Shem. The prospective victims were no longer considered to be human, but only as corpses waiting to be tossed into the scrap heap. They were known simply as Zeks, slang for the Russian term for prisoner, Zak Luchany, I don't know how to pronounce that. After a half-century of unequaled barbarism, the Russian experiment, quote-unquote, was exposed in all its horror by Solzhenitsyn, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Solzhenitsyn. He writes of the camps, many camp points were known for executions and mass graves. Orotukan and Polyarny Spring and Svitoplas and Anusaka, and even the agricultural camp Dakcha, but the most famous of all on this account were the Zoltisty goldfields, as Zoilitsty they used to summon a brigade from the mine face in broad daylight and shoot the members down one after another. Parentheses, and this was not a substitute for night executions. Those took place too. When the chief Gulag, Nikolai Andreevich Aglanov, arrived, he liked at lineup to pick out some brigade or another which had been at fault for something or another, and or it be taken aside, and then he used to empty his pistol into the frightened, crowded mass of people, accompanying his shots with happy shouts. The corpses were left unburied. Sollenstein goes on for many pages to describe the horrors of which our liberals knew nothing. Quote, but some transports of condemned Zeks arrived too late and they continued to arrive with 5 to 10 people at a time. A detachment of killers would receive them at the old brickyard station and lead them to the old bathhouse, to a booth lined with 3 or 4 layers of blankets inside. There the condemned prisoners were ordered to undress in the snow and enter the bath naked. Inside they were shot with pistols. In the course of 1.5 months, about 200 persons were destroyed in this way. The corpses were burned in the tundra. This is page 270. Solzhenitsyn continues. ABV was told how executions were carried out at Adak, A-D-A-K, a camp on the Petchora River. They would take the opposition members, quote, with their things out of the camp compound on a prisoner transport at night. And outside the compound stood the small house of the third section. The condemned men were taken into a room one at a time, and there the camp guards sprang on them. Their mouths were stuffed with something soft, and their arms were bound with cords behind their backs. Then they were led into the courtyard where harnessed carts were waiting. The bound prisoners were piled on the carts from 5 to 7 at a time and driven to the, quote, Gorka, the camp cemetery. On arrival, they were tipped into big pits that had already been prepared and buried alive. No, not out of brutality. It had been ascertained that when dragging and lifting them, it was much easier to cope with living people than with corpses. The work went on for many nights at Adak. Solzhenitsyn is not the only person to describe life in the Soviet concentration camps. Consider the following description of life in a gulag. Sergei Grigorians says that the prisoners were awakened at 5:30 a.m. and served a watery fish soup and brown bread for breakfast. At 10:30, the main meal, which was watery soup, the dinner is porridge. Grigorians said that the prisoners are constantly tortured through lack of food and the cold in the cells. Soviet law requires that the temperature in the cells be at least 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit. This is solemnly tested by the camp inspectors. They bring an electric heater into the cell, turn it on until the temperature reaches 64.4 degrees, make the appropriate notation on the report, and then take the heater to the next cell. The temperature then returns to its usual 40 degrees. A lamp is kept constantly burning all night in the cells so that the prisoners never really rest. Grigorians says that some 500,000 prisoners a year are released to return to Soviet society, and their presence has a very alarming effect upon the entire country. Here again, how pertinent is this report? It was published as an interview with Grigorians in the New York Times of February 22nd, 1987. It would be logical to suppose that this socialist society was built on the confiscated fortune of the late Tsar Nicholas II, but this is not the case. In 1913, the Tsar was undoubtedly the richest man in the world, with a personal fortune amounting to some $30 billion in 1913 dollars. He personally owned 150 million acres of land and some 30,000 servants, 500 automobiles in his personal fleet, 6,000 horses, 2 yachts, a personal gold reserve of $1 billion in the Imperial Bank, with $500 million worth of jewels, including the 200,000 Great Mogul diamond, a crown value at $75 million and $32,000 in diamonds. He controlled 1/6 of the surface of the entire globe. On the night of November 6, 1917, at 2 a.m., Red Guards drove a truck to the Imperial Bank and removed all of the Romanov gold and jewels. Much of the gold was later shipped directly to Kuhn Loeb Company in New York. We may recall that the senior partner of Kuhn Loeb, Jacob Schiff, had put up some $200 million of his own funds to finance the revolution. Apparently, it was a good investment. Victor Hammer fenced many of the crown jewels to collectors in Europe and the United States. The Dowager Empress Maria I'm on page 272, escaped with the considerable jewels in her personal collection. Both King George V and King Christian of Denmark repeatedly tried to get her to, quote-unquote, entrust her jewels to them for, quote-unquote, safekeeping, or at least for appraisal. She steadfastly refused, knowing that she probably would never see them again. When she died in 1928, special agents seized the jewels and immediately whisked them to Buckingham Palace. Her more important pieces later were seen in Queen Mary's personal collection. After the Revolution of 1905, the Tsar had prudently prepared for further outbreaks by transferring some $400 million in cash to the New York banks Chase National City, Guarantee Trust, J.P. Morgan Company, and Hanover Trust. In 1914, these same banks bought the controlling number of shares in the newly organized Federal Reserve Bank of New York, paying for the stock with the Tsar's sequestered funds. Thus, the Romanov family actually owns the controlling interest in the Federal Reserve banks today. Other deposits of the Tsar included 35 to 50 million in the Bank of England, 25 million in Barclays, 30 million in Lloyd's Bank, 100 million in the Bank of France, 80 million in the Rothschild Bank in Paris, and 132 million in the Mendelssohn Bank in Berlin. Since 1917, a cloud has hung over the financial structure of the Western democracies, threatening their jerry-built financial structure, the fear that some court somewhere might eventually rule that the Tsar's funds must be returned over to the rightful heirs. This would affect not only the ownership of the Federal Reserve Bank stock, but with payment of interest would mean the end of our 10 largest financial institutions. Does anyone wonder why the U.S. government, which is under total direction of the Big 10 banks, continually makes every effort to finance and feed the crumbling Soviet empire? Can anyone predict the financial calamity which would ensue if the Romanovs were restored to the throne of Russia and asked for their money back, or if they got a court ruling anywhere in the world to that effect? This is page 273. This catastrophe loomed on the horizon at one point. The New York Times of July 20th, 1929, reported on the progress of a lawsuit brought by the Tsar's mother and 32 of the Romanov heirs against Guarantee Trust and National City Bank. F. Dudley Kohler, an attorney representing James Egan, public administrator, issued the following legal notice, which appeared in the Law Journal. Notice is hereby given to all persons, corporations, banks, trustees, having assets, deposits, and securities of the late Nicholas II, that a statement and account of same is forthwith demanded, and in the event that no such statement of account is rendered, all such persons will be held responsible for the amounts, plus interest and the cost of discovery proceedings. Both the case and Kohler then disappeared from the pages of the New York Times. Apparently, no account or statements was ever given. To have done so would have provided legal evidence of the debt and would have made repayment inevitable. Charles Recht, counsel for the Soviet Union, retained Edward H. Follows to represent the Soviet government, but no further legal proceedings are to be found. Nevertheless, the Romanov demand did have tremendous repercussions. The threat of a tremendous withdrawal from two of New York's most overextended and precarious banks caused an underground pressure against call money or cash on Wall Street, which then precipitated the crash of 1929. Even though the Masonic Canaanites controlled the courts in the United States, they could not be certain that the Romanovs might not find a court in some other country which would grant them a judgment or even an injunction against guaranteed trust, a J.P. Morgan-controlled bank, and National City Bank, the Rothschild and Rockefeller Bank in New York. This threat, coming at the very height of the stock market boom of the 1920s, cast a pall over the wheelings and dealings of the speculators and caused immediate pressure on short-term funds, resulting in the Great Depression. To avoid such threats in the future, the Roosevelt-Litvinov agreements were concluded between the U.S. and Russia, United States and Russia in 1933 and 1934. In these agreements, the U.S. unilaterally recognized all claims of the Soviet government to funds of the Imperial Russian government. Whether this could be made applicable to the funds of Tsar Nicholas has never been tested in court. The Roosevelt-Litvinov Pact also put the diplomats of the world on notice that Roosevelt had now formalized the extended support formerly rendered to the Soviet government by quote-unquote private interests, such as the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and J.P. Morgan Company, since 1917. Not all of this was from private banks. It included a gift of $20 million from Woodrow Wilson's Special War Fund, which had been voted him by Congress. The money was dispatched to Russia by way of Elihu routes. The Red Cross, Kuhn Loeb Company, and many other Wall Street firms had been active in financing the Soviet government. Henceforth, that burden would be borne directly by the American taxpayers through subsidies provided to the communists by the U.S. government. The dedicated financial support of the communists by the world's leading bankers did not go unnoticed. Francois Coty, C-O-T-Y, founder of the perfume firm, wrote in, quote, Tearing Away the Veils, unquote, published by Revue Internationale des Secrets Societés, 1930, Paris, quote, the terms capitalism, socialism, and communism are so many themes distributed among well-paid demagogues to create confusion in the minds of the masses, destined to become slaves. Universal slavery is the immediate aim of the Bleich-Rother group, which they strive to attain through the medium of a new war, unquote. The Bleich-Rothers were the German representatives of the House of Rothschild. Wyndham Lewis, who during World War I had co-edited Blast and Vortex with Ezra Pound, wrote in the book, quote, Count Your Dead, They Are Alive, unquote. Quote, a Rothschild or a Morgan makes his money in a very different way from a Nuffield or a Ford. The former deals in money as a commodity. His business is essentially allied to that of a moneylender. He makes nothing. He toils not, neither does he spin. But for all that, he is no lily, as a rule. The latter, on the other hand, of the Nuffield Ford type, are creative to the sense that they do at least make something. Without loan capital, there would be no communism. The straight Bolshevik, say a Pollitt or a Strachey, though perfectly ideological, does not understand capitalism. Even Henry Ford is only a gigantic kulak. Ezra Pound called him the epitome of the American hired hand. And of all things the Marxist hates most on earth, he hates the kulak most. With loan capital, on the other hand, he has many affinities. Indeed, if loan capital were allowed to proceed on its way without interference, it would automatically result in communism. I felt that the Soviets were altogether too thick with the capitalists. I remarked that these lords of capital, who do not seem to hate communism quite as much as we would expect, do not belong to us. We get nothing out of these people, but they get a great deal out of us. The richer they become, and they are very few, the poorer we become. Wyndham Lewis's observation may have been inspired by the activities of the Left Book Club, which was directed by Victor Gulags during the 1930s, featuring Harry Pollitt, head of the Communist Party of Great Britain, John Strachey of the Daily Worker, and Claude Cockburn, alias Frank Pitcairn, editor of The Week, who was special correspondent to the Daily Worker at the Spanish Civil War battlefields. Gulags headed many front groups, such as Friends of the Soviet Union, Young Communists League, and Committee for the Victims of Fascism. No intellectual has ever started a committee for the victims of communism. This is page 276. After the Bolshevik Revolution, there were abortive communist uprisings in Germany and Hungary. The German Revolution was quickly eradicated, but Bela Kun, K-U-N, in Hungary actually established a short-lived communist reign of terror. His mass murders and lunatic orgies, he had formerly been a mental patient, left the nation bankrupt and devastated. When a legal government was restored, the Hungarian government published the archives of the Masonic lodges, proving that the, quote, communist revolution had entirely originated as the work of the Freemasons. The Hungarian government then closed down all Masonic lodges throughout the country. The Hungarian government later sought a loan from the U.S. to rebuild their shattered economy. Their officials were promptly informed that the United States government only made one stipulation before granting the loan, that all the Masonic lodges be restored and reopened. This proves that even in the 1920s, the Masonic Canaanites had already assumed full control over the government of the United States. Another great slaughter of the people of Shem during the 20th century occurred during the Spanish Revolution, 1936 through 39. The massacres were significant because they were a war of the Canaanites against Christians, and because they took place on the Iberian Peninsula, from Heber of the people of Shem. The slaughter of Christians in Spain began with the transfer of Soviet Russia's former peace delegate at Geneva, Rosenberg, also known as Moses Israel's son, with his staff of 140 trained killers to the office of the ambassador of Spain in August of 1936. This cadre of highly trained specialists in torture and murder inaugurated one of the most brutal campaigns in the history of Europe. Their atrocities were largely ignored by the world because the corps of journalists covering the Civil War were totally dedicated to the success of communism. They only reported news which was unfavorable to the quote-unquote fascists, as the Canaanites had contemptuously termed their opponents since the Romans had destroyed their world capital at Carthage. The Rosenberg murder teams were euphemistically called World Revolutionary Movement Purification Squads, unquote. Their work of purification consisted mainly of massacring priests, nuns, choir boys, and women, these being groups which were least likely to offer any armed resistance. Arthur Bryant, in his well-documented, quote, Communist Atrocities in Spain, unquote, tells of one murder squad which went to the Dominican convent in Barcelona and respectfully informed the Mother Superior that, quote, because of possible mob violence, quote, unquote, the nuns should accompany the squad to a place of safety. They were then taken to the suburbs and murdered. The communist leader justified his action as follows, quote, we needed the building. We didn't want to muss it up before we occupied it. E.M. Godin, in his book Conflict in Spain, says on page 72, During the last week of July 1936, the bodies of nuns were exhumed from their graves and propped up outside the walls of their convents. Obscene and offensive placards were attached to each of their bodies. Unquote. In Madrid, it was estimated that 1/10 of the population of Spain was murdered by the communist, quote, purification squads by 1939. De Fonteres in Red Terror in Madrid describes how Cheka murder team, organized by Dimitrov and Rosenberg, carried out a program of torture and killing so obscene that it cannot be reprinted here. I've heard these stories before. This is page 278. 3 more pages. Early in World War II, Soviet murder teams captured 15,000 Polish officers, the most educated and responsible element of in the population. They were never seen again. They were taken to 3 KGB-operated camps, Starbiask, Kozulsk, and Otashkov, where they were systematically murdered and dumped into unmarked graves. When the German army captured this area known as Katyn Forest, they were led to the graves. At the Nuremberg trials, the Soviets claimed that the Germans had committed these massacres. However, a congressional committee reported on July 2, 1952, that the Soviet NKVD had committed the massacres, which had been planned personally by Stalin as early as the fall of 1939. The domination of the people of Shem by the Masonic Canaanites always resulted in an aura of total hopelessness. All justice, all honor, and all hope for the future now disappears. The eminent journalist Don Cook states in his book, Flood Tide in Europe, that all journalists who go to communist countries are struck by the smell of communism. Quote, worst of all to me was the peculiar and unmistakable smell of Russia and the communist world which pervaded Leipzig. He continued, everyone who has ever set foot in the Soviet Union knows that smell, a stale, heavy, unwashed smell. He calls it the smell of old lavatories, carbolic soap, unwashed bodies. The Soviets have never bothered to produce such necessities as phone books, soap, and toilet tissue in their, quote, socialist economy. Because it is an almost total waste of the energies and talents of its captive people, the Soviet Union can exist only by massive infusions of capital from the Western democracies. Few Americans realize how much of the money extorted from their wages by the Internal Revenue Service is transferred directly to the Federal Reserve banks, and from there to Switzerland, where it is transferred to 5 Soviet banks. A defector from the Soviet Union reported in New York Journal American, March 2nd, 1964, that of a remittance of $1.2 million sent by the United States government to the CIA office in Vienna, the fund was distributed as follows: 1/3 to the Soviet secret police, 1/3 to the Communist Party of Italy, and 1/3 sent back to the United States to finance the Communist Party of the USA. Since World War II, when the OSS was handing out gold to the communists in Italy, the process has become more formalized. James Angleton, head of covert action in the CIA and former CIA chief in Italy, set up organizations in which funds were channeled to Masonic groups in Italy, the foremost being P2, which included most of the leading Italian government figures and businessmen. P2 was penetrated by Andropov after he took over the KGB. Lord Sackville of England had introduced Freemasonry to Italy in 1733. It became the vehicle through which the British Secret Service, quote-unquote, unified Italy through Garibaldi and Mazzini to produce, quote, the New Italy. The Italian Undersecretary of State, alarmed at the control which the Freemasons exercised over the Italian government in 1913, called for a law forbidding Masons from holding any sensitive office. quote, compromised by any hidden and therefore uncontrollable tie and by any motive of suspicion or lack of trust by the public, unquote. The measure was never passed, and the unfortunate undersecretary disappeared from his office. However, a decade later, Mussolini did outlaw Masonic lodges in Italy, causing the Canaanites to scream worldwide imprecations against, quote, the brutal dictator and fascism, unquote. Today, the red billionaire, quote unquote, red billionaire Jean-Baptiste Dumonge of France carries on the vital work of feeding the helpless Soviet Union with the finest produce of the European, quote, free democracies. He is a partner with Guy de Rothschild in distributing vegetables, the firm Stragi. Dumonge also directs the firms Interagra and SOCOPA, which recently furnished 1 million tons of soft wheat to the Soviet Union at far below market price. Dumonge regularly ships meat and butter to the communists at prices 1/4 of those which are charged to European consumers. The Soviet Union frequently reships these commodities back for resale at twice the price paid for them, thus gleaning hard currency from the European economies. None of this would be possible except for the international power of the Masonic Order of Canaanites.